In the blinding, unrelenting snow of the Rocky Mountains, one prospector found himself at the mercy of a fierce winter storm, with only the storm itself as his guide. As whiteouts swallowed the landscape and his compass failed him, he crafted a tool so unconventional it would change the way explorers navigated treacherous wilderness forever. Before we dive into this incredible survival tale, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this one move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The wind howled down the snow-covered slopes of the Rockies, an invisible force pushing against the prospector's every step. The dense flurries blurred his vision, each gust carrying with it the sting of ice. Above him, the gray sky offered no comfort, just a thick curtain of snow that threatened to bury him alive if he didn't find shelter soon. The mountains were unforgiving in the winter, and he had seen many men come and go, some dead from the cold, others lost to the wild. But today, as he trudged through the deep drifts of snow, he could feel it in his bones. This storm was different. It was as if the land itself had decided to test him. The usual tools that had kept him alive for so many winters, the compass, the map, were rendered useless in the swirling white abyss. His heart raced. The storm was so thick now that he couldn't tell which direction he was heading. He had been on this trail for days, confident that he was close to a small mining camp. But now the landmarks he relied on had vanished, swallowed up by the relentless snow. The compass, once a trusted friend, spun aimlessly in his hand, its needle a mocking reminder of his helplessness. Without it, he was blind, alone in the storm, unable to find his bearings. He stopped for a moment, his breath coming in sharp gasps, and forced himself to calm down. Panic wouldn't help him here. He had survived worse conditions before, but this storm seemed different. There was something unsettling about the sheer isolation of it, the way it distorted everything familiar. His mind raced, considering the possibility that he might never find his way out of this storm alive. The whiteout pressed in from all sides, and for the first time in years he felt the gnawing doubt that had been buried deep within him. Was this the end? Had the mountain finally claimed him, as it had so many others before him? With a slow, measured breath, he steadied himself. He couldn't afford to panic. He had to think. There had to be something he could do. His boots crunched in the snow beneath him as he began to move again, one step at a time, hoping against hope that his instincts would carry him through. He knew survival in this land wasn't just about skill. It was about ingenuity, resourcefulness, and the courage to face the impossible. It was about finding a way when all seemed lost. And in that moment, as the storm howled louder than ever before, the prospector made a decision. He would survive this. He had to. The search for gold had driven him west, far beyond the civilization he once knew, to the unforgiving heart of the mountains. For years he had wandered these wilds, driven by the belief that the land still held untold riches beneath its frozen surface. Many before him had come and gone, drawn by the same lure of gold, but only a handful had ever returned with more than a handful of dust. Gold was an obsession, a dream that consumed men to the point of madness, and for the prospector it had been no different. It had started as a mere rumor, whispered in the dusty corners of a mining town, and slowly it had become a compulsion. Every day he dug and scraped the earth, his hands raw from the labor, his back aching with the weight of his ambition. The mountains seemed to hold their secrets close, teasing him with the promise of riches that always seemed just out of reach. But the gold wasn't the only thing he sought. No, there was something deeper at play, a quiet, persistent need to prove something to himself, to show that he, too, could conquer these mountains, could outwit the unforgiving forces of nature that had claimed so many before him. In a world of brutal survival and constant struggle, gold became a measure of his worth, a symbol of success in a life that offered little comfort or guarantee. And so he had pressed on, each day a new battle with the elements, each night a lonely vigil beneath the stars, his thoughts consumed with the endless promise of gold. He had seen others fall, some lost to storms like the one that now trapped him, others swallowed by the wilderness itself. But he had always believed that he was different, that his resolve was stronger than theirs. After all, he had survived this long, hadn't he? Now, as the storm bore down on him, he couldn't help but wonder if he had been wrong all along. He had faced the hardships of the wilderness for years, grizzly bears, freezing nights, scarcity of food. But this storm felt like something more. It was as if the land itself had turned against him. Gold had always been the goal, the guiding light, but the reality of it now seemed so distant. The harsh winds, the blinding snow, the freezing temperatures, they were real. And in this moment, the gold he had sought for so long felt almost irrelevant. What mattered now was survival. Getting out of this storm alive, with his wits intact, was the only thing that mattered. The mountains, it seemed, weren't just testing his ability to strike it rich. They were testing his very will to endure. But even in his doubt, there was something within him that refused to give up. He was a prospector, and if nothing else, he knew how to dig, how to survive. And in that moment, survival became his most precious commodity. Gold could wait. The wind cut through the mountains with an almost predatory force, its icy breath biting through the prospector's worn clothes and stinging his face. He had been walking for hours, but with each step, the snowstorm seemed to get worse. The path he had been following had vanished, swallowed up by the relentless snowfall. He looked at his compass again, only to watch the needle spin wildly, offering no answers, no direction. His stomach twisted. What should have been a straightforward trek back to the small mining camp now felt like an impossible dream. He could feel the storm closing in around him, as if the wilderness itself had decided to claim him. His hands shook as he clenched the compass tighter, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The storm, the cold, the isolation, it all pressed in on him, making the world feel smaller and smaller. It was a feeling he had never encountered before. A quiet panic began to take root in his chest, spreading like wildfire. He had seen the others, men who had tried to brave the same wilderness, lost to storms just like this one. The thought of it chilled him more than the snow. For years he had prided himself on his ability to survive in this brutal environment. He had always found his way, no matter how harsh the conditions. But now, with the wind howling and the snow smothering every sign of life, he couldn't help but wonder if this would be the storm that finally claimed him. He needed to make a decision, stay in one place and wait for the storm to pass, or try to press on and risk getting even more lost. Every part of him screamed to keep moving. Moving meant life. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just the storm that threatened his survival. It was the cold, the isolation, the growing uncertainty of where he was and whether his instincts were enough to save him now. "Focus," he whispered to himself, trying to regain some semblance of control. He tried to recall the landmarks he had passed earlier, the shape of the ridge, the path beside the creek, but everything had dissolved into an endless sheet of white. He felt his grip on reality slipping, and the fear clawed at him again. It wasn't the fear of dying, it was the fear of being lost, of never being found. That thought lingered in the back of his mind like a shadow, pulling him deeper into the abyss. A sudden gust of wind knocked him off balance, and he stumbled, barely catching himself before falling face first into the snow. His heart pounded in his chest, the thundering beat echoing in his ears. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going, how much longer he could endure the isolation, but he couldn't stop. Not now. As his eyes scanned the blizzard for any sign of a familiar shape, his thoughts began to drift back to the one thing that had always kept him going: survival. He had been on the edge before, many times, but somehow he had always found a way back. But this time, with nothing but the swirling white void around him, he wasn't sure if that was enough. The storm continued to rage, pushing him further into the wilderness, But deep down, a quiet voice urged him to keep going, to trust his instincts, to trust the experience he had gained over the years. He had faced death before. Now it seemed he had to face it again. As the snowstorm raged around him, the prospector's mind raced. He was cold, exhausted, and on the verge of losing his grip on reality. The storm was a beast, a force of nature that felt almost alive, suffocating him with every passing minute. His body ached with the strain of moving against the wind, and he could barely keep his footing on the deepening snow. It was as if the world had turned against him, mocking his every step. He stopped again, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His compass had failed him, the needle spinning uselessly in the storm's grip. His mind swam with panic, his thoughts wild and disjointed. But then, in the midst of the chaos, something quiet surfaced. A memory, a fragment of an idea. It came to him suddenly, like a spark in the dark. A snow compass. He had heard of it before, years ago in passing. A strange, unconventional tool that some explorers had used to navigate through snowstorms when their compasses failed. The idea seemed absurd at the time. Who would trust a homemade compass in such a vast and unforgiving wilderness? Yet now, in the heart of the storm, the idea felt almost necessary. His mind cleared as he focused on the memory. The snow compass wasn't much more than a simple design made from a piece of wood, a few nails, and some clever adjustments, but it had worked for those who dared to use it. The thought of it filled him with a strange sense of purpose. Maybe it wasn't just about the tools he had. Maybe survival was about finding the right tool for the moment, no matter how unconventional. He glanced at the snow swirling around him, the endless white that seemed to stretch on forever. A sense of urgency crept into his thoughts. The snow compass had no guarantee of success, but it was better than standing still, waiting for the storm to finish him off. At this point, it was his only option. His hands, trembling with cold and exhaustion, moved instinctively to the supplies he had on hand. He had a few strips of leather, a piece of wood from his pack, and some wire. It wasn't much, but it was enough. With the skill of a man who had spent years crafting tools from the wilderness, he began to assemble the pieces. He wasn't sure it would work, but he had no other choice but to try. As he worked, his thoughts drifted. It was strange the way survival often led to innovation. The wilderness didn't care for one's plans. It tested you, pushed you to the limit, and in those moments of desperation, you either found a way forward or you didn't. And right now, he was willing to bet that this strange makeshift snow compass would be his way forward. Even if it was a long shot, it was the only shot he had. With a deep breath, he completed the crude compass, holding it in his hands for the first time. The storm still raged around him, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he had something to guide him. Something to give him hope. He could feel the cold, but it wasn't quite as suffocating now. He wasn't lost anymore, not entirely, and that small glimmer of hope was all he needed to keep moving forward. The wind howled in the distance, a constant reminder of the storm's presence, but the prospector's focus had narrowed. His hands were cold, his fingers numb from the relentless exposure, but the makeshift snow compass was in his hands. It wasn't much, just a simple, crude device fashioned from a piece of wood, some leather, and the last of his metal wire. But in this moment, it was his lifeline. The compass wasn't much to look at. The wooden disc was rough, its edges uneven. The needle was thin and wobbled slightly as it spun in place, far from the precision he would have expected from a proper instrument. But somehow, it felt right. He wasn't sure if it would work, if it would even give him an accurate direction, but right now, it was all he had. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. It didn't matter if it wasn't perfect, he just needed something to focus on, something that could give him a sense of direction in this vast, unrelenting snowstorm. His heart raced as he placed the compass in his hand, staring down at the delicate needle that now swung in a slow, deliberate arc. A strange thing happened. The needle settled, not in the way he expected, but in a direction that felt right. It wasn't a perfect north. The needle wavered slightly, but it pointed roughly in the right direction. It wasn't a miracle, but it was something. The small movement of the needle filled him with a sense of accomplishment, hope, even. For the first time in hours, he felt like he might be able to make it out of this storm alive. The snow continued to swirl around him, thick and disorienting, but he didn't look at the compass constantly. He kept it close, but his eyes were always scanning the horizon, trying to pick out the shapes of trees, rocks, or any hint of familiarity. Every few minutes, he checked the compass, always reaffirming the direction it pointed him toward. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He could keep moving. He adjusted his course, heading in the direction the compass suggested. The landscape around him remained a blur of white, but now he had a purpose in his steps. He couldn't see his destination, but he could feel the pull of the compass, pushing him onward. It was strange how something so simple could become such an anchor. The world around him might be disorienting, but the compass had given him a thread to hold on to. He moved cautiously, each step calculated, but with more confidence than he had felt in hours. The snow didn't seem quite as menacing now, not with the compass in his hand pointing him toward something, a destination, a way out. He wasn't completely sure where he was going, but for the first time since the storm had started, he was certain he was moving in the right direction. And that certainty gave him the strength to keep going. With the compass as his guide, he felt a renewed sense of determination. The storm was still a beast, still fierce and unrelenting, but it was no longer the only thing in control. He was moving with purpose now, with a plan. He wasn't lost anymore, and that in itself was a victory. The blizzard continued to rage, but the prospector's confidence had grown with each passing step. He held the snow compass in his hand like a precious artifact, its simplicity somehow providing more reassurance than any high-tech navigation tool could ever offer. The landscape around him remained unchanged, just an endless expanse of white, but he had learned to trust the compass. It wasn't perfect, but it was guiding him, and that was enough. The first few steps after he had begun following the compass had felt tentative, as if the storm itself would claim him at any moment. His mind kept racing with questions. Would this strange invention really lead him out of the wilderness? Would it fail him when he needed it most? But each time he checked it, the needle wavered, then settled, always pointing him in roughly the same direction. There was a comfort in the consistency, and soon the doubts began to fade away. As he walked, the storm pressed in on him, making every step feel like a battle. The wind cut through his clothes like knives, and his face was raw from the constant exposure. But it didn't matter. He had learned to live with the harshness of the land, and today the land was simply testing him again. The storm wasn't the real enemy. It was the self-doubt that had almost consumed him earlier. The snow compass was more than just a tool now. It had become a symbol of his resilience, a lifeline when all other hope seemed lost. With each hour that passed, his legs grew heavier. The cold seeped deeper into his bones, but he kept moving. He focused on the needle, watching it shift slightly with every gust of wind, but always returning to a steady course. It felt strange, trusting something so rudimentary. But there was a logic to it. He had nothing left but his wits, and if the compass could give him a direction, then it was worth following. He paused every now and then to scan the horizon. The trees were becoming more sparse, and the land was opening up into something he didn't recognize. Was he getting closer to safety, or was he walking further into the wilderness? He couldn't know for sure, but the compass never wavered. It guided him, and for now, that was all he needed. He had faced death in the mountains before, but never quite like this. The relentless force of nature had stripped him of his usual tools, his usual confidence. Now, all he had was a small wooden compass and the strength to keep going. There was no clear path before him, no sign that he was on the right track, but the compass was his anchor, and he chose to trust it. In that quiet moment, the prospector made a vow to himself. He would see this through. The storm would not take him. The wilderness would not claim him. He had faced worse, and he had survived. With the snow compass as his guide, he would survive this too. The storm raged on, but with each step the prospector felt the weight of the cold lift just slightly, as though the storm itself was no longer the only thing fighting him. The snow compass, despite its imperfections, was giving him direction, real, tangible direction. He clutched it tightly in his hand, his fingers numb, but his grip firm. The needle barely wavered now. It felt more certain, more trustworthy. The terrain beneath his boots had begun to change. The gentle rise of the snow-covered ground had flattened, and there were signs, faint but enough, that he was near something familiar. Perhaps it was a ridge or a valley he had passed days ago. He couldn't be sure, but his instincts told him he was getting closer to something. A landmark, a sign of civilization, anything that could signal the end of his solitude. With the compass in hand, he kept moving, each step heavier than the last. The wind howled in his ears, the cold biting through every layer of his clothing, but his heart was lighter. There was something different now. Where there had been fear, there was hope. Where there had been desperation, there was now a flicker of belief that he could actually make it. He paused for a moment, closing his eyes against the snow, taking in a deep breath. The silence of the storm wrapped around him like a cloak, a quiet paradox. In the midst of all the chaos, the small compass had become more than a tool. It was his anchor, tethering him to some kind of purpose in the overwhelming expanse of snow. For the first time since the storm had taken hold of him, he felt the storm was no longer his enemy. It was simply a part of the world, something to endure, not something to fear. Suddenly, through the haze of swirling snow, something caught his eye. A faint shape in the distance, a shadow amidst the white. A structure. His heart skipped a beat. His mind raced. Was it possible? Could he be nearing shelter, or even a path back to civilization? He quickened his pace, barely noticing the sharp pain in his legs or the frostbitten tips of his fingers. The needle on the compass was still unwavering, pointing the way with an almost eerie precision. The thought of the snow-covered shelter, the warmth inside, the safety it promised, drove him forward with a renewed vigor. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, but finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, he saw it. The outline of a small cabin, a trapper's shelter perhaps, or an abandoned outpost. The familiar shape of logs, stacked in the traditional cabin style, rose through the snowstorm like a beacon of hope. The prospector's heart surged with joy, his pace quickening to a near run. The cabin was a mirage no more. It was real. He had made it. The storm had not claimed him. With one final push, he stumbled toward the cabin, the door already in sight. And finally, with all the energy he could muster, he crossed the threshold. As the prospector stepped into the warmth of the small cabin, his body shook with exhaustion. The contrast between the biting cold outside and the warmth within was so sharp it made him dizzy. The scent of dry wood and stale air hit him immediately, but it was the smell of safety. He leaned heavily against the wall, the snow compass still clutched tightly in his hand, his chest heaving with the effort to catch his breath. Inside the cabin, the space was small, but it offered a shelter that he hadn't realized how desperately he had needed. The dim light filtering through the small window told him it was late in the afternoon, but time had lost all meaning in the storm. His legs were numb, his vision blurry from the cold. And for a moment he just stood there, breathing in the warmth, the quiet hum of the storm still raging outside. But even in this moment of relief, a part of him felt unsettled. The journey wasn't over. The storm still howled beyond the cabin walls, and even now he couldn't fully shake the fear that had settled in his chest. What if he was still lost? What if this shelter was another mirage? His mind raced with doubt. He set the snow compass down on the small table in the center of the cabin and moved to the fireplace, eager for heat. His hands, stiff from the cold, struggled to light a fire with the meager wood supply he found inside. His mind was sharp, but his body felt as if it were made of stone, every movement laborious, deliberate. The matches broke in his fingers, the kindling refusing to catch. It was moments like these, when all his survival instincts seemed to fail, that the doubts crept in. But then, with a small prayer to himself, the fire finally sparked. The flames licking up from the dry kindling, the warmth spread through the room, and with it, a small but important feeling of hope. He sat on the floor next to the fire, his back to the stone hearth, his hands outstretched toward the flame. It wasn't enough yet. He still needed to dry his clothes, get something warm into his stomach, and rest. But for now, the cabin was his refuge, and with every passing second, he could feel his resolve returning. But deep down, there was a question that lingered. Was it enough to just survive? To just make it through another day in this wilderness, gripped by the raw power of the storm? Or had he reached a point where survival alone wasn't enough? The question gnawed at him as he sat by the fire, the flickering warmth doing little to thaw the icy dread that clung to him. He had come so far, fought so hard to stay alive, but was it enough just to endure? The silence of the cabin felt like an answer, one he would have to face tomorrow. For tonight, he would rest. He would sleep with the knowledge that he had fought, and that the fight was not over yet. The days in the cabin passed slowly, the relentless storm outside offering no respite. It had been days since he'd found shelter, and the blizzard still held the wilderness in its grip. The prospector spent his time near the fire, tending to his wounds, drying his clothes, and resting, though sleep didn't come easily. His mind raced constantly, replaying his journey, the storm, and the snow compass that had led him here. But as the storm began to ease, he knew he couldn't stay forever. His food stores were minimal, and the cabin, though a haven in the storm, was a temporary stop. He needed to move on. The wilderness was vast, and he still had no idea where he truly was. But there was something in the stillness of the days that made him feel more prepared, more sure of himself than he had been when he first set out. The snow had begun to slow, the wind dying down, and the first slivers of daylight pierced through the cloudy sky. His fingers itched for the snow compass, the small wooden tool that had been both a lifeline and a symbol of his journey. He had grown accustomed to it, learned its quirks, and understood its limits. It had never been perfect, but in these conditions, it had been the only certainty he could trust. Now the world outside the cabin looked quieter, less chaotic, but still unpredictable. He stepped out of the cabin, the crunch of his boots in the snow breaking the silence. The landscape before him was no longer an impenetrable whiteout, but a field of endless snow, stretching in all directions. There were no obvious landmarks, no ridge or peak to guide him, but the prospector knew that if he just followed the compass, he would eventually find his way. His stomach twisted with a mix of excitement and fear. This was it, the final stretch. It was no longer about surviving the storm. Now it was about navigating the wilderness, making it to safety. He glanced down at the snow compass, the needle barely moving in the stillness of the air. With a steady breath he set off again, each step a step closer to the life he had fought so hard to keep. The journey had felt endless, but after several days of pushing forward through the snow, the prospector finally reached the edge of the mountains. The landscape began to shift as he descended into lower terrain, and the barren expanse of snow began to give way to the dry grasses and the rocky outcroppings of the valley. He had made it. The weight of the wilderness that had burdened him for so long began to lift, and with it came the knowledge that he had not only survived, he had conquered the very landscape that had threatened to take him. The snow compass, small and imperfect, had guided him through some of the most treacherous conditions he had ever faced, and though it had never been precise, it had been enough. He could see the distant outlines of a settlement ahead, a small town that he hadn't known existed. The sight brought a rush of relief, followed by a quiet pride. He had made it through the storm. He had found his way out. As he walked into the town, The people looked at him with curiosity, the wildness of his appearance a stark contrast to the tidy homes and familiar faces. But as he passed by them, he felt no shame. They would see the story in his eyes, the struggle, the determination, the will to survive. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to feel something else, peace. But the legacy of his journey was more than just his survival, it was the lesson he would leave behind. The snow compass, born from desperation and ingenuity, had proven itself not just a tool for survival, but a symbol of how necessity and creativity can change the course of a journey. What started as a simple, crude tool had helped him navigate through the wilderness and emerge victorious. Word of the prospector's journey spread through the town, and soon others were asking about the snow compass. It was no longer just a tool for one man, it had become a tool for many. A small, unassuming invention had changed the way people approached the wilderness, offering a new method of survival in a world where the storms could claim even the strongest. And so, as he stood there, taking in the sight of the town and the life he had fought to reclaim, he knew that this story, his story, would become a part of the frontier's legacy, a reminder of the power of human ingenuity, the will to survive, and the unexpected ways in which one man's journey can change the course of many.